They said the master's cane struck twice when he walked, once for his step and once for the one who followed beneath. At night, the sound came back alone, dragging its weight across the wood, searching for the man who had once owned it. The old house on the Carolina Hill was built on red soil and bone. Its timbers groaned with age, and the boards in the master's chamber whispered when no one moved. Some said it was the wind. Others swore it was memory itself, heavy with all that had been buried beneath. When Master Harlan took to walking again after the fever, the house learned a new rhythm: tap, drag. Tap, drag, the uneven beat of a man and his cane. The sound carried through the rafters like a sermon, sharp, slow, merciless. Yet even in daylight, some swore they heard a second echo that did not belong to him. "Only one foot hits the floor," muttered old Reuben, the cook, his voice low as he stirred the morning fire. "But the floorboards," they answer back. "Something down there remembering." The younger hands laughed it off, though never loudly. They said it was rats in the walls, or the restless air of summer nights. But those who had served longest, those who'd seen the crippled slave taken to the cellar years before, they never joined the laughter. They simply crossed themselves and whispered, "He's still hearing it." By the third night of August, the air was thick and swollen, the kind that makes sweat cling like oil. Master Harlan couldn't sleep. The fever had left him weak, his leg throbbing like a cursed drum. He sat upright in his bed, the moonlight spilling pale across his face, and listened. Tap. He froze. Drag. His pulse jumped. He pressed his palm to the floor. The wood was warm. The cane leaned by his bedside, heavy oak carved at the head with his initials, but he hadn't touched it. Still, the sound came again, from below this time, deep under the boards, a slow, limping rhythm scraping toward him. He told himself it was the servants, someone cleaning where they shouldn't be. But the sound did not come from the hall. It came up through the cracks like something crawling through the ribs of the house itself. Tap, drag, closer. He reached for his pistol. The candlelight flickered, and in that trembling light he saw the rug shift, and just slightly, as if something beneath had pushed against it. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Thick, waiting. At dawn, the housekeeper found him asleep in his chair, pistol across his lap, sweat soaking through his nightshirt. When asked what had troubled him, he only said rats, large ones. But later that day, as the slaves scrubbed the hallway, they found small streaks of red between the boards. Not rat blood, not quite. Too dark. Too thick. Old Reuben leaned in close, muttering, "Ain't no rat bleeds like it's remembering something." That evening the rhythm returned. Louder now. The walls shook with it. Down below, in the damp cellar where no one went since the storm of '53, something stirred. There had once been a cell down there, a place for punishment. The master himself had ordered it sealed after an incident they didn't speak of. But the nails rusted and the boards warped, and by moonrise a small gap had opened between the planks. From that gap came a sound, faint, wet, deliberate. Not breathing, not quite alive. The boy Samuel, who fetched coal from the cellar, heard it first. He dropped his lantern and ran, screaming that he'd seen a face through the boards, pale, cracked and smiling. Master Harlan ordered the cellar shut again, this time with chains. He said no man was to go below no matter what was heard. Yet in the days that followed, his temper worsened. His cane struck harder. The sound of it filled the house like thunder, shaking the windows, echoing through every corridor. And still there was always that second strike. That echo. Sometimes it came half a heartbeat later. Sometimes it answered before he did. On the seventh night, the servants woke to his screaming. They found him standing in the great hall, barefoot, his cane lying broken at his feet. The boards beneath him buckled as though something moved underneath. Slow, patient, aware. He pointed at the floor, his face grey with terror. "He's down there," he whispered. He never left. When they pried up the boards come morning, there was nothing. No bones, no hole, no body, only a hollow echo that trembled through the wood when you listened too long. Old Reuben refused to step on that patch ever again. "He waitin'," he said. "Waitin' for the one what put him there." That night the house slept uneasy. The air was thick with storm and rot. Near midnight, as the thunder rolled far off, the master stirred awake to a sound he knew too well. Tap. He froze. Drag. The sound came from inside the room, His breath caught. The cane leaned against the wall where he'd left it, but the shadow beneath it was wrong. It stretched too long, too crooked, reaching toward the bed, and then softly from beneath the floorboards a whisper, a voice like dry leaves. "You walk on me still, massa." But I'd learned how to walk too. The candle guttered. The sound came closer, louder, until the wood split, and something pale and trembling pressed upward through the crack, reaching for his ankle. He tried to run, but his leg, the same leg that had struck the crippled slave years ago, would not move. The dragging sound filled the room. Tap. Drag, tap, drag, and when morning came the chamber was empty, save for his cane standing upright beside the bed, as though held by an unseen hand. Each morning, before the sun touched the fields, a twisted shadow stood outside the master's window, though none could find its source. The slaves whispered that it wasn't cast by flesh, but by a promise broken in blood. The dawn came slow that week, not gold, not gentle, but gray and swollen, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The fields of South Carolina lay soaked in fog, every cotton stalk beaded with dew that looked more like sweat than blessing. They said the master had not slept since the night the boards split. He'd taken to sitting by his window before sunrise, staring toward the cane fields where the mist gathered thickest. His eyes were pale now, not with fear but with the kind of knowing that only comes when the dead begin to call you by name. And always just before the first light, it came. A shape. A long, crooked silhouette on the ground outside his window, bent, dragging, twisted. As if one leg belonged to another world. "Could be a trick of the morning," whispered the housemaid, her hands trembling as she laid the basin at his bedside. "Light playing tricks through the shutters." But the master only stared through the glass, his breath fogging the pane. "Light don't bend like that," he said. He'd measured it 3 nights in a row. The shadow came at the same hour, stood in the same place. Sometimes it leaned closer. Sometimes it stretched, as though trying to reach the window itself. And though it vanished with the rising sun, a faint mark always remained in the dirt where it had stood. A deep furrow, like something dragging its weight across the earth. Down in the quarters, the whispers grew heavier. "His shadow's not his own no more," said Reuben. "They say it walks where he can't," murmured another. One woman crossed herself and muttered, "Ain't no shadow without a soul behind it." But there was one who said nothing, a boy named Samuel, the same who'd seen the face beneath the floor. He hadn't spoken since that night. He only sat by the window watching the sunrise, lips moving soundlessly, as though mimicking the drag of a crippled step. When asked what he was doing, he'd only look up with wide glassy eyes and whisper, "It's waiting to be seen." By the 5th morning, even the overseer refused to go near the big house before dawn. He claimed the dogs howled without cause and backed away from the east wall, hay tails between their legs. That was the morning Master Harlan decided he would face it. He rose before the cock crowed, limped to the window with his cane clutched tight and waited. The air was still, heavy with rot from the swamp beyond the fields. When the first pale light touched the horizon, he saw it again, the crooked shape standing motionless just beyond the magnolia tree. "Show yourself," he rasped, pressing his hand to the glass. The shadow did not move. He threw open the window. Breath quick and the mist poured in, and cold, thick, smelling faintly of wet iron. "I said, show yourself." A wind rose from nowhere, bending the trees, stirring the dust at his feet. And for a heartbeat he swore he saw it clearly. A figure hunched, its leg twisted under it, its head bowed low. Then it was gone. Only the mark remained, the trail of something dragging itself toward the barn. The slaves found him standing in the yard, barefooted, whispering into the fog. They led him back inside, but that evening he ordered 2 men to dig where the shadow had stood. They begged him not to, said the ground there was cursed, old soil that never grew right. But he would not be swayed. The shovels hit something hard before noon, not wood. Not stone, bone, long, crooked bone, fused wrong, bent as though broken and never healed. One of the men screamed and dropped his shovel. The master struck him with the cane. "Cover it," he snarled. You didn't see nothing, but when they filled the hole, the ground kept sinking, as though something beneath it was breathing still. That night, the house went cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from wind or rain, but the deep, suffocating chill that lives inside walls. The lamps burned low. The air smelled faintly of rust, and in the hall the master's cane struck once. Then softly, faintly, a second sound followed. He froze. His hand trembled. "No," he whispered. "Not again." The echo came once more, but this time it did not stop. It moved across the room, dragging slowly toward the window. The master backed away, heart pounding, until his shoulders struck the bedpost. The curtain swayed without breeze. Then came the whisper, low, broken, but near enough to taste. "You took what was mine, massa. But I done learned how to take it back." In the morning, the housemaid found his window open and footprints in the dew below, one deep, firm print beside another that dragged. The prints led all the way to the magnolia tree, and then simply stopped. Above them, caught in the branches, hung the master's cane, wedged high in the crook of the tree, swaying gently in the wind, as though placed there by unseen hands. Old Reuben crossed himself and whispered, "He walkin' free now." When night fell, the moon rose swollen and red over the cotton fields. The servants barred the doors, but the wind carried a sound through the cracks, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, drag-a-tap, drag. But this time it came not from under the floorboards, nor from the earth outside. It came from the walls, and in the first light of dawn, a new shadow appeared beside the old one on the east wall of the house, crooked, uneven, but unmistakably two. In the quarters they prayed for mercy, all but one. His lips moved, but no God heard him. Only the soil beneath the cotton rows stirred in reply. It was said that every soul on that plantation learned to pray by force. The prayers were whispered, between lashes, carved into calloused palms, and buried in the soft dirt of the fields. They prayed for mercy, for sleep, for death, whatever name they dared give deliverance. But there was one who prayed differently. They called him Eli, though no one could recall if that had been his name before the chains. He'd been the crippled one, the one the master broke for trying to flee. The one who screamed not from pain, but from what he saw in the dirt when they pinned him down. After that night, they said, his words changed. He no longer prayed to God. He prayed to the ground. Years had passed since Eli vanished, swallowed by the earth, some said. Yet the prayers had not stopped. Sometimes when the wind was still and the cotton leaves lay quiet, the field hands swore they could hear him, a faint murmur, a slow rhythm, like breathing beneath the soil. "Don't say his name after dark," warned Reuben. "Hey, hear you," he answered. But Samuel, the boy who'd seen the face in the floor, didn't listen. He had taken to kneeling by the fields after sundown, pressing his ear to the dirt. "What you listening for, child?" the women would ask, their voices trembling. He'd smile faintly and whisper, "He's still praying, he praying for the wrong man." Inside the big house, the master had grown pale. He no longer slept. The shadow at his window had become his waking companion, and now even his dreams were full of whispering. Sometimes it was the voice of a man, sometimes the sound of roots moving through soil. Always it spoke the same words. "I asked, and he ain't answer, so I made my own." The preacher from Charleston came at the mistress's request, a pale man in black who smelled of tobacco and salt. He read scripture in every room, splashing holy water along the walls. But when he reached the cellar door, the water hissed and turned dark in the cup. The preacher stopped mid-prayer, his voice faltering. "There's something here," he murmured. "Something that don't answer to heaven." That night the quarters were restless. The air was thick and sweet with decay, as though the ground itself was sweating secrets. The hands gathered in the old meeting shed, clutching their Bibles, humming low, frightened songs. They prayed for deliverance, their words shaking through the wood. But as the amens rose, something else began to speak beneath them, a whisper in the foundation, crawling up through the cracks. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any tongue they knew. It was older, a humming rhythm that pulsed through the dirt like a heartbeat. "Stop!" someone cried. "You making it mad!" But the sound grew louder. The lamps flickered, the floorboards swelled. And when one man dropped to his knees, he swore he felt breath coming up through the ground, warm, damp, like the earth itself was alive. The next morning they found crosses carved into the cotton rows, dozens of them, bent and twisted, as though the plants had grown that way overnight. The overseer whipped 3 men for witchcraft, but the roots told a different story. When he pulled them from the soil, They came up shaped like fingers, black and knotted, clutching the dirt tight. The master said nothing. He only watched from his window, pale eyes fixed on the fields that had once obeyed him. And later, when he limped down to the prayer shed, he heard it too, the same soft hum pulsing up from the floor. He pressed his hand to the boards and whispered, "Eli?" The sound stopped. Then came a slow reply from deep below. "Still here, massa. Still prayin'. Only now I pray you hear me." He stumbled back, heart hammering, his cane striking the wood, once, twice. Each time the sound echoed back, lower, slower from beneath. Tap, drag, tap, drag. He fled the shed, his steps wild, the hum chasing him across the yard. The servant saw him running and thought madness had taken him, but in his eyes was something colder than fear. He locked himself in his chamber and fell to his knees beside the bed. For the first time in years he tried to pray, but the words came out wrong. The syllables twisted in his mouth like thorns, and when he whispered, "Amen," something whispered it back. By midnight the house had gone silent again. The fog returned, rolling thick through the cane fields. From the quarters came the faint sound of humming, soft, rhythmic, mournful. But in one corner of the field, near the magnolia tree, the soil began to stir. Slowly, gently, as if breathing. A small crack split the dirt. From it rose a single withered hand, the fingers curled inward as though still clutching something unseen. When the wind passed through the cotton, the leaves rustled, not like plants, but like pages, 1,000 voices whispering a name that had been forgotten by heaven. And under the moon the ground seemed to murmur, almost tenderly, "He ain't the only one that can pray." The master's cane was carved from oak, heavy, cruel, and etched with initials that weren't his. By the 7th whipping the wood began to darken, as though drinking from what it demanded. They said the cane was older than the master himself. It had belonged to his father, and his father before that. A family relic passed down like a birthright and a curse. Its shaft was dark as stormwater, capped with a brass head shaped like an open mouth. Some swore that if you listened close, you could hear it breathe when the wind passed through the hall. He carried it everywhere. It struck the ground like a metronome of cruelty, the rhythm of authority, of punishment, of pride. The slaves knew its sound the way sailors know thunder. The first strike meant warning. The second meant pain, but lately there had been a third sound, the faint, delayed, crawling behind it like an echo with weight. And that echo, they said, did not belong to the living. It began after the prayer shed incident. The master's hand trembled now when he held the cane, though he denied it. The brass mouth left imprints on his palm, small half-moon scars that never seemed to fade. He tried to clean it, to polish it bright again, but no matter how he rubbed, a stain remained along the lower shaft. It wasn't blood, not exactly. It was something thicker, older. At first he thought it came from the field and from the damp soil or the hands that had touched it, but the stain grew overnight, spreading up the cane like a slow infection. When the morning light hit it, it shimmered faintly red like veins under skin. In the quarters, they whispered of a reckoning. Every lash that cane gave, it took a piece of something, Reuben muttered. Ain't no wood can drink so much without remembering the taste. They said Eli's spirit had found its home in the thing that had crippled him, that his blood had soaked deep into the grain and made the oak remember what it had done. Now every time the master struck the earth, the ground seemed to answer. That week he grew restless. He beat the servants without reason, struck the cane against walls, tables, even his own leg, as though trying to prove he still ruled the thing in his hand. But the house had changed. The walls seemed to pulse with heat when he walked. The shadows followed him too closely. The mistress avoided him. The servants crossed themselves when he passed. Hand still, he struck the cane, tap, 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 until one morning he noticed something carved into its side, faint like a scar in the wood. Letters, not his own initials. A single word, written in the crooked scrawl of a hand that had once known chains. Eli. He stared at it for a long time, his breath shallow. Then, with a snarl, he took his knife and scraped at the letters until the blade dulled. But by the next sunrise, they were back. Deeper this time, fresh as if carved from within. He burned the handle that night in the hearth, thinking it would end whatever madness haunted him. The fire roared high, devouring the oak, turning it black. When the flames dimmed, he stepped closer and froze. The cane stood untouched in the ashes, its brass head glinting like an open eye. By now the others refused to enter his room. Only the boy Samuel dared come near, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He watched the master sleep, if it could be called sleep, his hands clutching the cane across his chest like a cross, and in the darkness Samuel saw the oak move. It pulsed once, slow, like breath. The brass mouth opened slightly, and from it came a faint, low hum, the same tune the field hands had once sung in their prayers. The boy backed away, whispering he'd learn the sound of him. The next day, the master awoke with bruises around his wrist, shaped like fingers. He blamed the servants. He blamed the wind. But the bruises were warm to the touch, as though something had held him through the night. He looked at the cane. Its wood gleamed slick and wet. When he struck it once against the floor, a drop fell from its tip. Red, dark. He touched it and felt it pulse. That evening, thunder rolled across the lowlands. The air grew thick and electric. He walked the corridor alone, his cane clicking like a heartbeat against the boards. As he passed the portraits of his ancestors, he felt their painted eyes following him, not in judgment, but in fear. He stopped at the great mirror at the end of the hall and stared at his reflection. The candlelight trembled. His face was pale, hollow, aged. But it wasn't his reflection that froze him. It was the reflection of the cane. In the mirror, its brass head was gone. In its place was a hand, a gnarled, blackened hand gripping the shaft, twitching, trying to rise. He dropped the cane. It clattered to the floor and tap, drag, and when he stooped to lift it, the wood burned cold in his grasp. A voice slid up through the grain, low and wet, whispering, "You carried me far, massa. Now I carry you." By dawn, the house had gone still again. The mistress found him in his chair, the cane across his lap, his eyes open but empty. On the palm of his hand was a mark, dark and twisted, shaped like the open mouth of the brass head. The servants refused to touch him. Only Reuben dared look close. When he leaned in, he swore he saw something moving beneath the skin of the hand, a thin black line curling upward toward the heart. He turned to the others and said, "Ain't no cane no more. It done took root. They buried the master that evening." The cane was laid beside him, though some begged to burn it, but the grave never stayed still. By morning the soil had cracked and a thin, crooked sprout had grown from it, bark dark as iron, the shape of a man's hand at its tip, and when the wind passed through the magnolia trees, the branches tapped the ground twice, once for his step, and once for the one who followed beneath. No one entered the barn after the storm of '59. The smell of iron lingered there, and chains rattled in rhythm, though the peg on the wall stood empty. They said the storm came not from the sea, but from the swamp, rolling low, green and wrong. It carried a heat that made the air taste of copper, a storm that made men remember what they'd buried. When the lightning struck, it didn't burn the trees. It split the soil, and from that split, something began to breathe. The barn stood at the edge of the property, where the cane fields thinned and the earth turned black. The roof sagged like a spine under the weight of years. No one had been inside since the night Eli disappeared. It had been his cell once, his prison. They'd chained him there when the fever took his leg, when the master said he was too slow for the rouse. For weeks they heard him singing, soft, cracked hymns that made the animals restless. Then one night he went quiet. When they opened the door at dawn, all they found was his chain, snapped in two like a twig, and a wet handprint in the dust. After that, the barn was sealed. But now, after the storm, the chains rattled again. At first it was faint, a lonely clink of metal swaying on old nails. Then as the wind died, the sound grew heavier, slower, deliberate. Like breath in the dark, old Reuben heard it first. He was tending the livestock when the mule began to scream. The sound made his bones ache. He turned toward the barn and saw the door moving, not swinging but pulsing, as if something on the other side was breathing against it. He dropped the lantern and ran. By morning, the others found the door shut tight again. But in the mud just before it were tracks, half-prints dragging uneven. The master's widow, pale and gaunt, ordered the place boarded again. But no matter how they nailed it, the door would be open by dawn. The nails bent in the night, twisted out from the inside. Soon the smell came. It wasn't the smell of rot. It was older, a deep iron scent that clung to the skin. "Blood don't stay that long," one of the field hands whispered, "unless it's still got something to feed." That night, the wind rose again, humming through the cane fields like voices. The barn groaned under its weight. Inside, something moved, slow, deliberate, dragging against the boards. The horses screamed until their throats gave out. The dogs howled and clawed the dirt. And in the quarters, Samuel woke crying, clutching his chest, whispering, "He's trying to stand." When morning came, the barn door hung wide open. No wind, no storm, and just silence. The overseer, driven by pride and liquor, went in first. He carried his whip like a sword, laughing at the others for their fear. Inside, the air was thick and wet, heavy with dust and something older. The ground squelched under his boots. He found the peg on the wall where the chain once hung, empty still. But beneath it, half buried in the straw, was the chain itself, coiled like a serpent, slick with something dark. He reached down to lift it. The metal was warm. He froze. Then slowly the chain began to move. Not fall, not slide, but move, curling around his wrist like it was breathing. He screamed and swung his whip, but the chain tightened, digging into his skin. It pulled hard once, twice, and the barn door slammed shut. By the time the others reached it, the screaming had stopped. When they forced the door open, the overseer was gone. Only his hat remained, crushed in the mud. The chain hung once more from its peg, dripping something that steamed when it touched the ground. The widow ordered the barn burned. They gathered torches, circled the place, and prayed as the fire caught. The flames rose high, licking the night sky, but halfway through the blaze died. Snuffed out, the wood still smoked but did not burn. The air turned heavy. The horses fled. Then came a sound from within. Tap, drag, tap, drag, the rhythm of a cripple's walk. The widow dropped her torch, her breath catching. From the darkness behind the doorway, two pale lights flickered, not flame, not eyes exactly, but the shape of seeing. She stumbled back, choking on her own breath, whispering, "Eli." The name hung in the air like a curse. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and iron once more. The barn door creaked open, only an inch, maybe two, but enough to see movement within. Something swayed from the rafters. Something heavy, and beneath it in the dirt the chain began to crawl. By dawn the barn stood still again. Smoke rose from its roof, though no fire had touched it. The servants found the widow's footprints in the mud, leading straight to the door, then stopping. Beside them was a second set, larger, dragging. Inside, the floor was marked with furrows, deep and curved, like something had been walking in slow circles all night. On the wall, scrawled in black streaks that smelled of rust, were the words, "He ain't yours to keep." For weeks after, no one went near, but every night as the fog rolled in, the chains began their song again, metal on wood, slow and patient like a heartbeat, and sometimes, in the half-dark between thunder and silence, a shape could be seen moving through the open door, hunched, dragging one leg, the faint outline of a cane swaying in its hand. When they crushed his leg, they thought they broke him. But the doctor swore that the bone fused wrong, growing like a root, twisting toward something beneath the plantation. It began with the doctor's trembling hands. He had seen breaks before, clean, sharp, righteous things that could be set and forgotten. But what lay beneath Eli's skin that night was something else. The bone had split, yes, but it refused to stay broken. It pushed back against the doctor's knife, as if the body itself rejected mercy. He said the fracture pulsed under his fingers, alive, and when he cut too deep, something inside the wound moved. The doctor left that night without a word, his eyes wet, his Bible forgotten on the floorboards. After the breaking, Eli was left to heal in silence. They chained him to his cot in the sick room beside the kitchen, where the heat never left and the flies gathered even in winter. The master said the punishment would make him humble. The others said it would make him hollow, but it did neither. At night they heard him whispering, back not to God but to the floor. The wood would creak in answer, slow and rhythmic, like an old tree stretching its roots. Weeks passed. The leg should have rotted by then, blackened, gone soft with fever, but Eli began to stand, first on one leg, then both, limping but steady, his shadow stretching long and wrong in the firelight. One night, when the storm winds came again, the girl from the quarters, Lila, crept in to bring him water. She found him awake, staring at his bandaged leg, "Don't look at it," he said softly. His voice was low, cracked, and something in it made her freeze. "It don't want you to look." She tried to ask what he meant, but he smiled. A slow, tired smile that wasn't his. The candlelight flickered across his skin, and for a moment she saw the bandage shift, like something beneath it was breathing. By morning, the cot was empty. The chain still hung from the wall, snapped clean. The master ordered the men to search the quarters, the fields, even the marsh. But all they found were drag marks through the mud leading to the edge of the cane field. Then the marks simply stopped. The dogs wouldn't go near. They barked at the air, tails tucked, growling at something the eye couldn't catch. That evening the doctor returned. He said he'd dreamed of the leg, of bones splitting and roots curling in the dark. He came trembling, muttering about unnatural healing and the wages of blood. He demanded to dig where Eli had lain, to see what had been beneath the floor. The master, prideful and afraid to show it, allowed it. They pried up the planks. The stench hit first, wet earth, mold, and something older, sweet and foul. Beneath the boards was no soil, no crawl space, only roots, thick, pale tendrils curling up from the blackness, pressing against the wood as if hungry for the air. And buried among them, half consumed, was the iron shackle from Eli's ankle, twisted into the roots like a relic offered to something that fed. The doctor screamed. The master ordered the floor sealed again, but by then something in the house had begun to move. The slaves whispered that night of footsteps in the hall, dragging and uneven. The master blamed them, cursed them, struck one until his knuckles bled. But later, when he walked alone to his room, he heard it too. A slow, wet thud. Drag, thud, drags still following him through the corridor. He turned once, twice, 3 times. No one there. Then he saw it, a mark on the floorboards. Muddy, half a footprint, and beside it a single indentation of a cane. It wasn't deep like a man's weight, but sunk into the wood as if something beneath had pressed upward. That night, the house began to groan. The walls swelled like lungs. The glass in the windows trembled with every breath, and from the floor beneath the master's bed came a new sound, soft at first, like a hand brushing wood. Then slowly a cracking. The boards split. A smell of blood and wet earth filled the room, and from the narrow opening, something pale and bone-like pushed through, curling upward. Searching, he fled the room screaming, clutching his cane, and when he struck the floor in panic, the sound echoed from beneath him, twice, once for his step, once for the one who followed. By dawn the house had gone still, but the servants found the master's cane lying in the hallway, bent, wet and black at the tip. No one dared touch it. Only Lila, the girl who had brought Eli water, crept close enough to see what stained it. It wasn't blood. It was sap, thick, red and pulsing. She looked to the walls and saw hairline cracks spreading upward like veins. The house seemed to breathe again, faintly. And from the earth outside came a low hum, a sound too deep to be wind. That night she dreamt of Eli standing in the cane fields. His leg was no longer crooked. It was rooted. The earth clung to him, feeding, pulsing with every beat of his heart. And behind him, stretching toward the mansion, were more shapes. Thin, pale, human-shaped things growing from the soil like crops. When she awoke, her window was open. The smell of iron filled the air, and outside, through the mist, the cane swayed, though there was no wind, bending toward the house, bowing as if in reverence. By morning, the doctor had vanished. The floor where the master's bed had been now bulged upward, the planks split by something pushing through from below. The servants fled. The widow prayed, but Lila stayed one last night. She said she could hear him still, not outside but underfoot, whispering to her through the boards. When asked what he said, her voice shook. He said, "The roots remember the ones who bled." The next day the fields turned black. The cane stalks split open from within, their fibers streaked with red. And when the wind passed through, it didn't sound like rustling leaves. It sounded like breathing. Not even the crickets dared to sing that night. The overseer found the cotton white as bone by dawn, every stalk standing still, as if listening. It began with the quiet. The plantation had always been alive after dusk, frogs groaning in the marsh, wind hissing through cane, the night insects pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. But that evening something took the sound. It didn't fade, it stopped. The silence dropped all at once, thick and smothering, as though the air itself had been choked. Even the dogs refused to bark. They only stood with ears flattened, staring toward the fields, trembling as if they heard something no human could. The overseer, half drunk and angry, took his lantern and walked the fence line. The air pressed against him, heavy, damp, full of a faint iron sweetness that clung to the throat. The sky was low, bruised with clouds, and the moon shone through them like a single white eye. At first he thought the stillness was his imagination, but then as he stepped between the rows, he realized the truth. The cane wasn't moving, not a sway, not a whisper. Each stalk stood stiff, straight as a grave marker, their edges slick with dew that gleamed like sweat. The overseer's boots sank into the soil, soft, too soft. He knelt to touch it. The mud was warm. He drew back his hand, heart thudding. The warmth didn't come from the day's heat. It came from below. He turned to leave, but the light of his lantern faltered. The flame hissed, guttered, then went out. In the dark, the silence became unbearable. He could hear his own pulse pounding in his skull, and beneath it, faint and steady, something else, a sound like breathing, drawn deep through the soil. He froze. Then came the smell, not of rot or rain, but of something raw, alive and open. The earth shifted. A stalk beside him bent forward, slow and deliberate, its fibers creaking like rope. He stepped back and another followed. Then another, until the entire row leaned toward him, their leaves brushing together in a slow, rustling whisper. And through that whisper came a voice, faint, cracked, familiar. "You took too much." The overseer stumbled backward, choking on fear. The field swallowed the sound of his scream. By morning, the others found him at the edge of the property, face down in the mud. His eyes were open, his mouth full of soil, but it wasn't the death that made them whisper. It was his hands, buried wrist-deep in the earth as though he'd been trying to crawl inside, and around him every stalk of cane had turned bone white. The silence lingered through the next day. No birds. No frogs, no wind. The only sound was the creak of the great house, its timbers moaning as though remembering something heavy. The slaves worked slower, whispering prayers under their breath. The widow watched from her balcony, pale as the cotton below, clutching her rosary until her knuckles bled. She said it was God's punishment. But the old ones in the quarters knew better. They said the earth was waking, that Eli had gone into it and the land had begun to listen. That night the moon rose red, the silence deepened. The fields glowed faintly under its light, every stalk casting a perfect shadow, every shadow stretching toward the house. Lila sat at the window of her cabin, unable to sleep. She could feel it, a low vibration beneath her feet, steady as a heartbeat. It pulsed through the floor, through her bones. When she looked out, she saw the canes moving again, not with wind but with purpose. They shifted, parted, forming paths that led inward, toward the old barn, and in the distance, where the earth met the trees, something glimmered, faint, like lanterns swaying in a slow procession. She rose barefoot, and followed. The path wound through the white stalks. The deeper she went, the warmer the air became. The ground quivered beneath her, and with each step the faint hum grew louder, not sound but a feeling that filled the chest, pressed against the ribs. When she reached the barn, it was open. The door swayed on one hinge, tapping softly. A tap, drag, tap, drag. Inside the air was alive. The chains on the wall trembled without wind. The straw writhed as though insects moved beneath it. But when she knelt, she saw no bugs, only roots, pale and thin, spreading like veins, and there in the corner, the floor had split. From the crack, something pulsed, not light, not heat, but life. It beat in rhythm with her heart. She took a step closer. The roots seemed to hear her. They shifted, reaching upward, twining like fingers. She whispered his name, Eli. The moment the name left her lips, the air snapped. The silence broke. Every sound returned at once, and frogs, wind, the far-off crash of thunder, but twisted, distorted, as though the world had been playing backwards all along. The roots lashed outward, coiling around the walls, the beams, the rafters. The barn shuddered. Lila turned to run, but something caught her ankle, not tight, not cruel, just holding. She looked down. It was a hand, half buried in the soil, pale and wet, trembling with effort. And beneath it, through the shifting roots, she saw the outline of a face, eyes open, mouth moving soundlessly in the dirt. He wasn't dead. He was becoming. By dawn, the storm had passed again. The barn stood still. But every cane stalk across the fields had changed. Their tips were red now, faintly glistening in the morning light. And at the heart of every row something new had grown, pale, jointed, shaped like bone. The master's widow fell to her knees when she saw it. She clutched her rosary until the beads cracked between her fingers. "The ground's remembering," she whispered. "The ground don't forget." That night no one slept. The air was too still, too watchful. Every breath carried the same rhythm, deep, slow, patient. The crickets didn't return. The birds didn't sing, and when the sun rose again, it didn't rise over the fields at all. It rose behind them, casting the long, crooked shadow of the barn across the house. And in that shadow something moved, dragging one leg, tapping once with a cane. Smoke rose from the great house, though no fire was lit. Inside the flue, voices murmured his name, and the ash took the shape of hands. It began as a faint hum, a restless vibration that crept down from the chimney like breath. The house had been cold for weeks. No one dared light the hearth since the night the fields went white. Yet still, each dawn a curl of smoke rose through the chimney, pale and slow as if something deep inside it was exhaling. The widow said nothing at first. She'd grown used to strange things. The walls had begun to sigh in their sleep, the floors to groan when no one walked them. But this was different. The smoke didn't smell of wood or ash. It smelled of the barn, of rain and iron and something that had once been alive. By the third morning the servants began to whisper. They said the house was remembering, that the fire was not burning fuel but names, every name the master had ever spoken in anger. When the widow asked the cook to sweep the hearth, the woman refused. "It speaks," she said, her voice trembling. "It calls him." The widow struck her and did it herself, but when she knelt before the empty grate, she froze. The soot was not black, but it was dark red, almost wet, and as she leaned close, she swore she saw movement in it, faint ripples like the skin of a pond. Then came the whisper, "Eli," soft, almost tender, the way a mother calls her child in from the dark. She stumbled back, her breath catching. "Who's there?" No answer, only the faint stirring of ash. She rose, trembling, and stepped away. But as she turned, she saw it, a print, half a hand pressed into the soot. Long fingers dragging upward, as if something beneath had tried to climb through. The widow fled. That night, the voices grew stronger. They came not only from the chimney, but from the walls themselves, a low, hushed chorus that seemed to speak through the cracks, through the wood, through the spaces between breaths. Sometimes it was laughter, wet, weak like someone laughing through water. Sometimes it was weeping, and sometimes beneath the whispers came the sound of a cane, tapping once, twice in the hollow dark. The slaves in the quarters heard it too. The sound carried through the fields like a sermon, weaving through the cane, echoing faintly in the rafters of the barn. Lila could not sleep. She swore she heard Eli's voice in that hum, not pleading, not cursing, but calling. When the wind blew from the house, the smoke coiled down the chimney of her cabin, grey fingers reaching into her dreams. In one of them she stood before the mansion's hearth. Inside, where the flames should have been, there was only earth, dark, wet, and pulsing. From it grew roots shaped like ribs, twisting up toward the mantel, and in the hollow space between them, something whispered, "He still waits in the fire that never burned." She woke, gasping, her sheets damp with soot. The next morning, the widow summoned the preacher from the neighboring parish. He came by horseback, Bible in hand, his eyes bright with holy certainty. He blessed the doorways, scattered salt on the floor, and ordered the chimney opened so that he might cleanse it of Satan's rot. They pried open the grate. The air that came out was thick and wet, heavy enough to taste. The preacher gagged, then struck a match. The flame flared green. He held the Bible high, began to pray, but the words faltered. The smoke rose in twisting strands, curling toward him, tracing along his sleeve. Then, from deep within the chimney, came a voice, not loud, not shouting, but clear, as though spoken directly behind him. "This house burns from the floor, not the roof," the preacher screamed, stumbling backward. His match fell, and for a moment, just a moment, and the hearth ignited. But the fire that came was not red. It was white, It burned without heat, without smoke, and yet it devoured. The wooden mantel blackened, the stone cracked, and the shadows on the wall began to move. They shifted in rhythm, not random, not chaotic, but breathing. The widow fell to her knees, clutching her rosary. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, and from the fire a voice answered, not Eli's this time, but the Master's. "I said he'd learn his place." The flames roared, swallowing the sound, until nothing was left but the slow crackle of settling ash. When the light died, the hearth was cold again. The preacher was gone. Only his Bible remained, its pages fused shut. The leather blistered as though something inside had burned its way out. The widow ordered the fireplace sealed. But each night after, smoke still rose, thin, grey, defiant, and the whispers continued. By the seventh night, the house could no longer contain them. The voices poured from every chimney, every crack, every keyhole. They filled the halls, murmuring in unison, dozens, then hundreds, their words overlapping until they became a single endless sound. It was not a prayer. It was not a curse. It was a remembrance. The slaves awoke, screaming, clutching their ears. The widow collapsed at her window, eyes wide, staring at the fields, for out there in the dark the canes were swaying, though there was no wind. And as they bent, their tips brushed together, making the same whispering sound that filled the chimney. The house and the field spoke as one, and above it all, faint but steady, came the tapping of a cane, moving closer. By dawn, the smoke had stopped. The air hung still and heavy, grey as sorrow. The servants who entered the mansion found soot on every surface, on the walls, the ceilings, even the widow's mirror, but what they saw there made them drop their brooms and flee, for in the soot, etched across the mirror's glass, were the prints of two hands, one large and strong, the other twisted, crooked, dragging one finger shorter than the rest, and between them, written in the ash, "The fire remembers." That night, the widow's room stayed dark. The house groaned once more, a deep, hollow sigh from its foundations, and then came the sound of footsteps on the stairs, uneven, dragging, tap. Step, tap, step. They stopped at her door. The knob turned once, slow, deliberate, then twice, and when the door opened, the smoke poured in like a living thing. He woke to find footprints, uneven, dragging, circling his bed. Each night, the circle grew tighter until the print stopped at the edge of his throat. It began with the sound of something soft brushing across the floorboards, a faint, wet drag, like a limb that had forgotten how to move. The Master stirred beneath his sheets, the sweat on his skin colder than any dawn. Outside, the plantation slept. The fields were dark and hushed, every leaf held still as if listening for something that had already begun. He turned his head, slow, cautious. Moonlight spilled through the window and caught the pattern on the rug, a half-circle of prints darker than dust, misshapen as though pressed by a crippled foot. He sat up. The prints stopped just short of his bedpost. The cane he always kept beside him, his symbol of control, had fallen, rolling to the corner where the light would not reach. The next morning, he told no one. Pride chained his tongue. He ordered the servants to scrub the floor and burn the rug. But when night came again, the sound returned, a drag, step, and this time it was slower, more deliberate, as if whatever walked there knew the distance it had yet to travel. By the third night, the Master had begun to keep a pistol on the nightstand. He did not sleep so much as wait, his body frozen, his ears straining for the rhythm he feared most. The house was silent, but he could hear something beneath it, a breath, a pulse, a steady rhythm of pain that throbbed in the wooden walls. The air carried a smell of damp earth and iron, faint but growing stronger, as though the grave itself was breathing through the floor. When the noise came again, it was closer than before. The sound of dragging filled the room, circling, until he could count each pause between the steps. He aimed his pistol toward the sound, but his hand trembled. The hammer clicked, but there was nothing. No figure, no face. Only the impression of weight shifting the boards beneath him, a pressure rising from below, pressing upward through the planks. Then came the whisper. It wasn't words, not truly. More like the exhale of someone who had never forgiven the living. Still, he understood it. Not yet. By the fifth night, his servants refused to enter the Master's chambers. They said the door was cold to the touch, that the wood wept in the corners. He locked himself in with the pistol and a candle that burned too low too fast. The wax pooled around his hand, and in its soft hiss he heard that dragging sound again. It circled once, then twice closer now, until he could feel it, the cold air moving against his ankle. He looked down and saw the print forming there on the floor beside him. Not blood, not mud. Something grey, wet and heavy, the colour of bone after rain. He scrambled back, the pistol clattering against the wall. The footprint pulsed once, as if breathing, then split. A second. Smaller print pressing beside it. Drag, step, the circle was closing. By dawn, the master was found on the floor, sitting upright against the bedpost, his eyes open but unfocused. Around him, the circle of footprints had completed, a perfect ring of uneven steps in the dust. The servant swore he spoke only one thing before his breath gave out. He's almost here. And though they buried him that afternoon, facing east as was custom, the night that followed carried that sound again through the halls. A dragging step. Uneven, patient, circling a bed that now stood empty. Outside, the wind pressed through the cane fields like a whispering tide, bending the stalks toward the house. Each rustle sounded like footsteps, each pause like breath, and far beneath the floorboards of the master's room something shifted, closer to the surface than before. They buried him standing, facing east, as was the old custom. But when the sun rose, it cast no shadow where he stood, only the limp drag of another, moving toward the house once more. The grave was shallow, too shallow, the kind of burial a man gives when he wishes to be done with the dead, not to honor them, but to hide what he fears might rise again. They said the master was put in the ground before dawn, his cane laid across his chest, the pistol at his side. The preacher mumbled words he didn't believe, his voice trembling like a man reading scripture from memory but not faith. The soil was damp from the night's rain, and when it struck the coffin lid it made a hollow sound, a sound that didn't stop echoing. Some claimed they heard a knock from below before the last shovel of dirt fell. Others said the knock came from within the house, beneath the boards that had begun to swell with damp and rot. No one spoke of it again. Not aloud. Days passed, but the plantation would not rest. The air hung thick and sweet, the scent of turned earth drifting through every open door. The cane fields, once rustling with wind, stood rigid, stalks bending toward the graveyard like parishioners before a sermon. At night, the overseer's dogs would howl toward the east, their voices warping into a sound that did not belong to beasts or men. Then, on the seventh night, the sound returned, faint, rhythmic, unmistakable. Step, drag, step, drag, from the direction of the field. By morning, the overseer found the footprints, uneven, deep, cutting through the mud between the rows of cane. They led from the burial mound, past the old well toward the house. The prints stopped only at the threshold, where the master's cane now leaned upright against the door, coated in fresh soil. No one claimed it. No one dared to move it. The cook swore she saw a figure by the edge of the field that same evening, stooped, leaning on something. The shape swayed as though learning to walk again, the head tilted as if listening to the wind. Yet the wind had gone still. The crickets had stopped their song. Even the horses refused to stir. Something was waiting to cross that last stretch of earth between the fields and the porch. That night, the candles in the great house would not stay lit. The flame bent low each time it flickered, like it feared being seen. The servants gathered in the kitchen, whispering prayers they half remembered from their mothers, but none dared speak the crippled one's name. Not after what they had heard through the chimney, a rasping breath, a whisper like bones grinding together, and a single word, stretched long as a curse, return. The ground outside groaned as if something moved beneath it. Near midnight, the house shuddered. The boards in the master's room bulged upward, just once like something pushing from below. The cane fell where it leaned, striking the floor twice. Once for the step, once for the one who followed. The sound was answered by another, from the field. A drag, a wet, deliberate drag. Then silence. The next flash of lightning revealed the window panes slick with dirt, not rain but mud, smeared by something that had touched them from outside. In the streaks a shape lingered, 5 crooked marks, each thinner than bone. By dawn the field was empty. The earth where the master had been buried was torn open from the inside. His pistol was found half buried in the mud, the trigger locked back, one shot fired. But no body lay in the coffin. Only his cane remained, planted upright in the soil, darkened now, slick with something black that wasn't rain. The initials carved into it had deepened, swelling as though burned from within. And in the quiet, beneath the rising hum of the morning insects, came a sound from far across the field, faint but growing closer. Step, drag, step, drag, step, drag. The sound didn't fade with the sunrise. It grew steadier, louder. The living turned away from the windows, too afraid to see what the earth had given back. By the time the sun reached its highest point, one shadow lay stretched across the veranda, crooked, leaning, and too long for a man. And though the master's grave was open, the crippled one's shack lay empty. The soil beneath both still moved.